Pick up any plastic storage bin, a power tool housing, or the back panel of your TV right now and knock on it. Go ahead. It sounds hollow, right? And if you've ever cracked one open, an old printer, a broken appliance, anything, you've probably noticed a web of thin ridges running across the inside surface. Little walls inside the wall. Most people figure that's just how plastic comes out, like it's a side effect of the manufacturing process. It isn't. Those ridges are one of the most deliberately calculated features in the entire product. Pull them out, and the part collapses under normal use. Put too many in, and the part warps coming out of the factory, looking like a potato chip somebody left on a dashboard in August. That tension between strength and warping, between structure and material cost, is what plastic engineering is actually about day to day. And honestly, the reason so many plastic products feel weaker than they look has almost nothing to do with the quality of the plastic itself. This is the part most people never hear about. I want to start with why plastic is genuinely difficult to work with structurally, because it's not obvious. Most plastic products you own were made through a process called injection molding. You take plastic pellets, and the same kind shipped in 50-pound bags to factories all over the Midwest and Southeast, melt them down to somewhere between 400 and 500 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the specific material, and inject that molten plastic into a precision-machined steel mold under enormous pressure. We're talking up to 20,000 pounds per square inch. The plastic fills the entire cavity in under a second, then it cools, solidifies, the mold opens, and the part gets ejected. Sounds clean? The problem is what happens during that cooling phase. Plastic shrinks as it cools. Not a little polyethylene, which is in about half the plastic containers in your kitchen right now, can shrink up to 3% of its total volume. On a 12-inch part, that's more than a third of an inch of movement happening inside a rigid steel mold, while the material is still semi-soft, and it doesn't shrink uniformly. Thick areas of the part cool slower than thin areas, so different sections are pulling at different rates, while everything is still just soft enough to deform permanently. That's where sink marks come from. Those subtle depressions you sometimes see on the outer surface of a plastic part, usually directly over a thicker section underneath. That's also where warping comes from, where a panel that's supposed to be flat comes out of the mold slightly curved or twisted at the corners. So right away, the designer has two rules pulling in opposite directions. Thicker walls are stronger, but thicker walls cause more shrinkage, more sink marks, and more warping. And thicker walls mean more material, which in a product where the margin on each unit might be $2, matters a lot. The answer the industry landed on, and this goes back decades, is structural ribs. A structural rib is a thin wall that runs perpendicular to the surface you're reinforcing. If you have a flat panel that needs to resist bending, you can either make that panel 6 millimeters thick, which will warp badly and show sink marks on the visible surface, or you keep the panel at 2 millimeters and run a series of ribs on the back face that are 6 millimeters tall. Those ribs create what engineers call a T-beam effect. It's the same structural principle used in steel construction for over 150 years, just scaled down to something you can hold in one hand. Here's the part that surprised me when I first got into this. The rib itself has to stay thin. The standard rule is no more than 60% of the wall thickness it's attached to. If your main wall is 3 millimeters, your rib can be at most 1.8 millimeters wide. That ratio is nearly universal in product design guidelines. Go thicker than that, and you create a concentrated mass of plastic right at the junction between the rib and the wall. That mass cools slower than everything around it, pulls harder during shrinkage, and telegraphs a sink mark straight through to the opposite side of the part, the side the customer sees. You've just put a visible dent on the outside face of your product, trying to make it stronger. Rib height has a similar constraint. The general ceiling is 3 times the wall thickness. Beyond that, the rib becomes hard to fill completely during injection. The plastic simply can't flow all the way to the tip before it starts to freeze, and you get incomplete fills or structural voids inside the rib itself. So you end up with this precise grid of correctly proportioned ribs that if you replace them with solid material thinking you were making the part more robust, would actually produce something weaker and definitely uglier because of how badly it would warp. Now here's where the fake strength reputation comes from, and I think this is the most interesting part. When you hold a ribbed plastic part, what you're feeling is the outer shell. That shell might be 2 millimeters to 2.5 millimeters thick on a typical consumer product. A 2 millimeter shell of ABS plastic, the stuff in most electronics housings and appliances, has about the same bending stiffness as a sheet of cardboard by itself. So when you squeeze the side of your TV and it flexes, or you press on a laptop lid and it creaks, that's not a sign of cheap manufacturing. That's the outer skin doing exactly what it was designed to do, stay cosmetically perfect. The ribs on the inside are handling the structural load, but only when the load hits them in the right direction. That's the catch. Ribs running vertically stiffen the panel against bending along a horizontal axis, but press directly inward on the flat face, and vertical ribs don't help much at all. That's why parts have rib grids, crossing patterns, so there's resistance in multiple directions, and it's why parts feel solid in some spots and almost paper thin in others. You're literally feeling where ribs are located underneath and where they aren't. Engineers have a term for this, anisotropic stiffness. The part resists force differently depending on which direction the force comes from. It's not a flaw in the design, it's a deliberate consequence of building structural capacity from geometry rather than mass. Wall thickness strategy goes even further than just rib placement. One of the core goals in injection molded design is keeping wall thickness as uniform as possible across the whole part. Not always because uniform thickness is structurally ideal, but because uniform walls cool at the same rate and shrink at the same rate. Uniformity prevents the internal stress that causes warping. When a product designer draws a transition from 2 millimeters to 5 millimeters wall thickness in the same part, the person running the mold flow analysis will flag that immediately. Abrupt thickness changes cause the molten plastic to race ahead through thin sections and stall in thick ones. You get incomplete fills, weld lines where two flow fronts meet and bond imperfectly. Those lines are always weaker than the surrounding material, and differential shrinkage that twists the entire part out of tolerance. The fix is gradual transitions, tapers, radii, gussets, geometry that lets the thickness change slowly over distance rather than jumping abruptly. Look at the inside of any well-engineered plastic housing and you'll see these tapers everywhere. They look almost organic, like the geometry is flowing from one section into the next. That's not an aesthetic choice, that's an engineer negotiating with material physics. The simulation software used to predict all of this before a single piece of steel gets machined. The main platforms as of 2026 are Moldex 3D and Autodesk Moldflow. Can model the entire injection process digitally. It predicts where weld lines form, where air traps, how the part warps after cooling, and where sink marks appear. A mold for a typical consumer product runs anywhere from $15,000 to over $500,000 for something complex like an automotive interior panel. Running the simulation costs a small fraction of that and can prevent a mold revision that takes 6 weeks and costs $40,000 to fix. Most serious product development cycles run multiple simulation iterations before anyone orders steel. There's one last piece of this that ties everything together, and it explains something you've probably noticed without ever connecting it to any of this. Look at the bottom or inside surface of almost any injection molded plastic product, and you'll find small circular or teardrop-shaped marks, usually arranged in a loose grid or along the center line. Those are gate marks, the exact points where molten plastic entered the mold cavity. The gate is where the material arrives hottest, fastest, and under the most shear stress. The molecular structure of the plastic is slightly different right at those points because of what it went through getting there. Where the gates go is one of the most consequential decisions in the whole design process. Gates in the wrong location create weld lines in structurally critical areas, exactly where you don't want them. They cause what's called jetting, where plastic shoots across the cavity in a stream instead of flowing as a wave front, leaving a visible streak across the finished surface. They create pressure imbalances that result in walls coming out thicker on one side of the part than the other. On a laptop base or a car door panel, there might be 4 or 5 gates precisely positioned to balance flow across the entire cavity, push weld lines only into areas that will be hidden by assembly, and keep cavity pressure uniform enough that wall thickness lands within 0.5 millimeter of target across the entire part. That positioning work happens in simulation, gets revised 2 or 3 times, and then gets cut into the steel. By the time you're holding the finished product, those decisions are invisible, which is exactly the point. So the next time you squeeze a plastic product and it flexes more than you expected, or knock on a panel and it sounds hollow, that's not necessarily a sign it was made carelessly. It might mean someone spent 3 months running mold flow simulations to make sure that 2 millimeter shell comes out dimensionally accurate, cosmetically clean, and structurally sound in the directions that actually matter during normal use. The engineering challenge with plastic has never really been about adding raw strength. It's about adding the right kind of strength in the right places without the material fighting back through warping and shrinkage during manufacturing. And most of the time, the answer is those thin little ribs on the back face that nobody ever sees. If you've got an old broken appliance sitting around that you don't mind sacrificing, crack it open. Look at the inside of the housing. You'll see the rib grid, the tapered wall transitions, the gate marks, the draft angles on every vertical surface. It's essentially a physical textbook on injection molding sitting in your parts bin. Way more interesting than it has any right to be. If this is the kind of thing you find yourself actually curious about, there's a lot more to cover. The material science of why different plastics fail in completely different ways, why the plastic in a car bumper behaves nothing like the plastic in a water bottle, even though they look similar. Subscribe so you catch that when it comes out. And I want to know, what plastic product have you run into that flexed or felt weaker than you expected? Drop it in the comments. Some of those answers are going to be genuinely interesting.